When I turned 70, I set the table for 8 and waited for the people I had spent my entire life feeding, loving and forgiving, but by 8 o'clock, I realized I had been quietly erased from my own family. I had started preparing that dinner 3 days earlier, moving slower than I used to but still careful with every detail, the way I'd always been. The roast went into the oven at exactly 4:30, just like my late husband used to prefer, low and steady so the meat would fall apart with just a fork. I polished the silverware even though no one had asked me to, and I set out the good china I only used for holidays, the plates with the thin gold rim that I'd kept safe for decades. There were 8 place settings. Mine at the head of the table, Michael's to my right, Sophie across from him, and the children's spots closer to the center where I could see their faces when they laughed. I even wrote their names on small cards, though I knew exactly where everyone would sit. It wasn't about necessity. It was about respect. About showing them that this night mattered to me. At 5:15, I changed into a navy dress I had bought just for this birthday. Something simple but elegant. Something that made me feel like I still belonged in a room full of people. I brushed my hair, added a touch of lipstick, and for a moment, standing in front of the mirror, I almost believed this would be a good night. At 6 o'clock, everything was ready. The food was hot, the candles were lit, and the house carried that quiet kind of anticipation that only comes when you expect to hear voices any second. I stood by the window and watched the street. Every pair of headlights made my heart lift just a little. 6:15 passed. Then 6:30. I told myself traffic was heavy. Maybe they stopped to pick something up. Maybe the kids needed a bathroom break. There are always small reasons for small delays. By 7, the roast had cooled just enough that I turned the oven back on for a few minutes. I didn't want it to dry out. I didn't want anything to feel neglected. 7:30 came with no knock on the door, no text, no call. Checked my phone. Twice, then a third time just to be sure I hadn't missed something. Nothing. At 7:45, I sat down at the table just for a moment, just to rest my legs, and I looked at the empty chairs arranged so carefully around me. 8 chairs. 8 silent witnesses. At 8 o'clock, I blew out the candles. Not all at once. One by one. The house felt different after that. Quieter but not peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that presses against your ears, the kind that makes you aware of every small movement, every breath. I stood up, walked into the kitchen and turned off the oven. The smell of the roast lingered in the air, heavy and unnecessary. That's when my phone buzzed. For a second I felt relief so sharp it almost hurt. I wiped my hands on a towel and picked it up quickly. It wasn't a call. It wasn't even a message to me. It was a notification. Sophie had posted something. I don't know why I opened it. Maybe part of me already knew. The picture filled the screen. A long table at a restaurant I recognized from downtown. The kind with white tablecloths and soft lighting. Michael was there, smiling in a way I hadn't seen in months. The kids were sitting beside him, laughing, their plates already half empty. And Sophie stood at the end, her hand resting lightly on Michael's shoulder, her smile wide and effortless. The caption read, "Perfect family night." I stared at that sentence longer than I should have. Perfect. Family. Night. All 3 words, and none of them included me. I set the phone down on the counter carefully, as if it might break if I moved too quickly. Then I looked back at my dining room, at the table I had set for people who had already decided not to come. And for the first time that evening I didn't feel confused. I didn't feel worried. I understood. This hadn't been a mistake. This had been a choice. And somewhere between lighting those candles and blowing them out, I had stopped being someone they made time for, and become someone they could simply leave behind. I did not throw the food away that night, not right away, because something in me resisted the finality of that kind of action, as if putting it all into the trash would mean admitting that none of it had ever been meant for anyone but me. Instead, I covered each dish carefully with foil, one by one, the way I had done countless times before after family dinners that had ended with laughter and full plates, except this time there were no voices echoing in the house, no chairs pushed back, no half-finished conversations drifting through the rooms. I placed the leftovers into the refrigerator with slow, deliberate movements, making space where there was already too much emptiness. The cake stayed on the counter for a while longer. I stood in front of it, looking at the smooth frosting, the small number 7 and 0 I had pressed gently into place that afternoon, thinking how carefully I had lined them up so they would look straight in photographs that were never taken. After a minute, I lifted the cake and set it inside the refrigerator as well, closing the door with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have. The house settled into silence around me, the kind that feels heavier at night, when there is nothing to distract from it. I walked back into the dining room and began clearing the table, stacking plates that had never been used, folding napkins that had remained perfectly placed in empty laps that never existed. Each chair went back under the table in the same position I had pulled it out earlier, as if I could rewind the evening by restoring everything to how it had been before the waiting began. When I finished, I stood there for a moment, looking at the room as it returned to its usual order, and I realized how quickly something that had meant so much could disappear without leaving any visible trace. The next morning, the sunlight came in through the kitchen window just like it always did, soft and steady, landing on the same spots it had for years, but it felt different somehow, like it was lighting a space that no longer belonged to the same life. I made coffee and sat at the small table by the window, holding the mug between my hands even after it had cooled, not because I wanted to drink it, but because it gave me something to hold on to. My phone sat beside me quiet. No messages. No apologies. No explanations. I thought about calling Michael just to hear his voice, to give him the chance to say something that might make sense of what had happened, but I did not reach for the phone. Instead, I stared out into the yard and let the silence answer for him. It was not the first time something like this had happened, and that realization came slowly like a memory rising through water. There had been other nights, other invitations that had been met with last-minute changes or vague excuses, other moments when I had been told plans had shifted and it would be easier if I stayed home. At the time, I had accepted those explanations because that is what you do when you love people. You give them the benefit of the doubt. You assume there is a reasonable answer somewhere you just have not been told yet. But sitting there that morning, with the quiet stretching out in front of me, I began to understand that those moments were not separate incidents. They were part of something larger, something that had been unfolding slowly, carefully, until it reached a point where they no longer needed to pretend. I picked up my phone again and opened the photo from the night before, looking at it more closely this time, studying the details I had missed in that first moment of shock. The way Sophie stood slightly closer to Michael than necessary, her hand placed just so, as if to anchor him there. The way the children leaned toward her when they laughed, their attention guided, their energy centered around her presence. And Michael smiling relaxed, completely at ease in a world that did not seem to have room for me anymore. I set the phone back down and took a slow breath, feeling something shift quietly inside me. Not a sudden burst of anger or grief, but something steadier, something colder. I had spent years making space for them, adjusting, understanding, waiting for the right moment to be included again. But as I sat there in the stillness of my own kitchen, I realized that moment was never coming, not because it had been delayed, but because it had never been part of their plan to begin with. It was not until later that afternoon that I began to notice the smaller things, the details that had always been there but never felt important enough to question, the kind of moments that slip past you when you are too busy believing in the version of your life that feels comfortable. I opened my calendar on the kitchen counter, the one I still kept in paper form even though Michael had offered more than once to set me up with something digital, and I started flipping back through the past few months. First it looked ordinary. Appointments, grocery lists, reminders to call the pharmacy. But then I began to see the pattern. A dinner I had been invited to that was suddenly moved to a different day, one I had not been told about until it was too late. A school play for my grandson that I had marked down, only to be told the time had changed, except when I checked later it had not. A Sunday lunch that had turned into a quick visit at the front door because they were on their way out. None of those moments had seemed significant on their own. Each one had come with a reasonable explanation, something small enough to accept without pushing back. But together they formed something else entirely, something deliberate. I rested my hand on the calendar and stared at the pages, remembering how I had adjusted each time without complaint, telling myself that families change, that schedules get busy, that I should be grateful for whatever time I was given. The memory of those adjustments sat differently now, heavier, like something I had been carrying without realizing it had weight. I reached for my phone again and opened my messages with Michael, scrolling slowly through weeks of short exchanges. We will reschedule. Maybe next time. Things are hectic right now. His words were polite, careful, never unkind, But there was a distance in them I had not wanted to name before. There were no long conversations anymore, no spontaneous calls, no questions about how I was doing beyond the surface. I could not remember the last time he had asked me something and waited for the answer. And then there were the messages from Sophie, the few she had sent directly. They were always friendly, always warm on the surface, but now I noticed what they did not say. She never included me in plans, only informed me after decisions had already been made. She never asked if I wanted to join, only explained why it might be better if I did not. It might be too much for you. The kids will be tired. We are trying to keep things simple. Simple had never included me. I set the phone down again and leaned back in my chair, letting the realization settle fully this time. This had not happened overnight. It had been built step by step, choice by choice, until it became something that no longer required effort on their part. Excluding me had become normal. I thought about Michael as a child, the way he used to run toward me without hesitation, the way he would tell me everything about his day, even the smallest details, as if my listening was as important as his speaking. Somewhere along the way, that connection had been redirected, reshaped into something quieter, something that fit more easily into the life he had built with Sophie. I did not blame him entirely. People change when they build families of their own. They shift their focus, their priorities. But this felt different. This felt like something had been guided, influenced, carefully arranged until the version of me that existed in their world was no longer necessary. I stood up and walked to the sink, rinsing the same cup I had already cleaned that morning, just to have something to do with my hands. The water ran longer than it needed to, filling the silence with a soft, steady sound. And as I turned it off, I understood something I had been avoiding since the night before. I had not simply been forgotten. I had been replaced, not in name, not in title, but in function. I was no longer the center of anything. Not the table, not the plans, not even the memories being created without me. And once that truth settled in, it did not feel sharp or overwhelming. It felt clear. Cold but clear. That afternoon, I found myself standing in the hallway outside the guest room, the one I had quietly turned into a storage space over the years, and for a moment I could not remember why I had stopped there. The door was slightly open, just enough for me to see the edge of an old dresser and a stack of boxes I had not touched in a long time. I pushed it open gently and stepped. Inside, the air carrying that faint, familiar scent of things kept too long in one place. I was not looking for anything specific, but my hands moved anyway, shifting through the boxes with a kind of slow intention, as if I already knew there was something in there I needed to see again. It did not take long. Near the bottom of one box, beneath old photo albums and folded linens, I found a small wooden case. I recognized it immediately. It had belonged to my husband, something he kept by his bedside for years, always locked, always within reach. After he passed, I had put it away without opening it, telling myself there would be time later, that some things did not need to be rushed. I carried it to the window and sat down, resting it on my lap. For a moment I just looked at it, tracing the edge of the wood with my fingers, remembering how careful he had always been with his belongings, how deliberate he was in the way he handled anything that mattered. The key was still taped underneath, exactly where he had told me it would be, though I had never tested that truth until now. My hands were steady as I unlocked it, which surprised me. I had expected hesitation, some kind of emotional resistance, but there was none. Just a quiet sense that this moment had been waiting longer than I had. Inside were documents neatly arranged, each one placed with the same precision he brought to everything else in his life. On top was a letter, my name written in his handwriting, clear and unmistakable. I did not open it right away. Instead, I lifted the papers beneath it, scanning the titles, the legal language, the familiar structure of something carefully prepared. Property records, account statements, documents I had seen before in pieces but never like this, never all together, never organized in a way that told a complete story. I turned a few pages, my eyes moving over numbers and names, and that was when I noticed it. The ownership lines. The signatures. My name repeated again and again, not beside his, not under his, but alone. I paused, reading more carefully now, following the language, the clauses, the way everything connected. It took a few minutes for the meaning to settle fully, not because it was unclear, but because it was so far from what I had assumed all these years. The house. The accounts. The assets I had believed were shared, managed, controlled in ways I had never questioned. They were not arranged the way I thought they were. They had been placed somewhere else entirely, somewhere I had never been directed to look. I set the papers down slowly and picked up the letter, finally opening it. His words were simple, direct, just like he had always been. He did not explain everything. He did not need to. But there was one line that stayed with me, one sentence that seemed to echo louder than the rest. If the day ever comes when you feel alone in your own home, read this again and remember that you are not as powerless as they might think. I read it twice, then a third time, letting it settle in the same way everything else had that morning. Not with shock, not with disbelief, but with a kind of clarity that left no room for confusion. I looked back at the documents spread out beside me, at the names, the signatures, the structure he had built quietly, without drawing attention, without making a point of it. He had seen something. Maybe not the details, maybe not the exact shape it would take, but enough to know that one day, I might need something more than patience and understanding to hold my place. I closed the box and sat there for a while longer, the light shifting slowly across the floor, the house still silent around me. But the silence did not feel the same anymore. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. And for the first time since the night of the dinner, I realized that I was not the only one who had been observing, adjusting, preparing. I had just been slower to understand it. Now I did. And once you understand something like that, you do not unlearn it. You do not go back to waiting at the table, hoping someone else will decide you belong there. You start to consider what happens next. The next morning, I did not rush into anything because rushing had never been my way, and it certainly would not serve me now, not when every step I took from this point forward needed to be deliberate, measured, and fully understood. I placed the wooden case back where I had found it, but I did not lock it this time. There was no need to hide something that had been meant for me all along. Instead, I carried a few of the documents into the kitchen and laid them flat on the table, smoothing them with my hands as if they might somehow rearrange themselves if I looked away for too long. The sunlight caught the edges of the pages, highlighting the signatures again, my name written in a place I had never expected it to be, repeated in a way that felt both unfamiliar and undeniable. I poured myself another cup of coffee, though I barely tasted it, and sat down across from the papers, reading each line more carefully now, slower, allowing the meaning to unfold in full rather than in fragments. The structure was clear. My husband had not left things to chance. He had not assumed that time or good intentions would preserve what mattered. He had planned, quietly, thoroughly, without announcement. And in doing so, he had placed something in my hands that I had not yet decided how to use. I thought about Michael then, not as the man he was now, but as the boy he had been, the one who trusted easily, who believed that people would treat him the way he treated them. That part of him had not disappeared. It had simply been redirected, shaped by someone who understood how to guide it without ever appearing to force it. Sophie had never argued with me directly. She had never raised her voice or created a scene. Instead, she had made small adjustments, subtle suggestions, each one reasonable on its own, each one easy to accept, until the end result looked natural to anyone who had not been paying close attention. I had not been paying close attention. Not until now. I picked up my phone and looked at it again, not to check for messages this time, but to consider what it meant that there were none. No explanation. No apology. Not even an attempt to soften what had happened. That silence told me more than any words could have. It told me that they did not see a need to fix anything because from their perspective, nothing was broken. This was how things were supposed to be now. Set the phone down beside the documents and leaned back in my chair, letting the pieces settle into place. There was a difference between being excluded by accident and being removed by design, and once you recognize that difference, you cannot pretend it is something else. I stood up after a while and walked through the house, room by room, not looking for anything in particular, just taking it in as it was. The living room where Michael used to sit on the floor with his toys, the hallway where his height was marked in pencil year after year, the kitchen where I had cooked more meals than I could count, not just for him, but for the family he had built. Everything was still here. Nothing had been taken. And yet, something had been shifted in a way that could not be seen from the outside. I returned to the kitchen and gathered the papers into a neat stack, aligning the edges carefully before placing them back into the wooden case. I closed the lid, not as an ending but as a pause. Because I was not ready to act yet. Not in the way they might expect. I had spent too many years reacting, adjusting, making space for other people's decisions. This time I would do something different. I would watch. I would wait. And I would decide when the next move was mine to make. I waited 3 days before I did anything that could be noticed because timing matters more than action when you are dealing with people who believe they are in control. On the 4th day I called Michael. Not immediately in the morning, not late at night when emotions tend to rise, but mid-afternoon, the kind of time when people are distracted, when their guard is lower because they do not expect anything significant to happen. He answered on the 2nd ring, his voice familiar but distant in a way I could now recognize clearly. "Hey, Mom," he said, casual, almost relieved, as if he had been expecting the call but did not know when it would come. I did not mention the dinner. I did not ask where he had been or why he had not shown up. Instead, I kept my tone even steady, the same way I had spoken to him for years. I was thinking of having everyone over. Again, I said. There was a pause, brief but noticeable. I could hear something shift on his end, the subtle hesitation of someone recalculating. "Oh," he replied softer now. "That sounds nice." Nice. Not apologetic. Not concerned. Just convenient. "This weekend," I continued. "Nothing complicated. Just a simple dinner." Another pause, longer this time. Then I heard her voice in the background, faint but unmistakable. "Sophie." He did not mute the phone. He did not step away. He simply let her speak where I could almost hear her, though not clearly enough to make out the words. I waited. "Yeah," he said finally. "We can do that." "We." Not I. Not "we would love to." Just "we can." I nodded, even though he could not see me. "Saturday at 6, I said, the same time as before. "That works," he answered quickly this time, as if the decision had already been made for him. "The kids will be excited." I ended the call with a simple goodbye. No added warmth, no extra reassurance. When I set the phone down, I did not feel anything immediate. No anger. No satisfaction. Just a quiet confirmation that things were unfolding exactly as I had begun to expect. That evening, I did not prepare anything for dinner. I made something small for myself and left the kitchen as it was, no extra effort, no unnecessary gestures. Instead, I sat in the living room with the wooden case beside me, not opening it, just letting it rest there within reach. I thought about the way Sophie had inserted herself into that call without speaking directly to me, the way her presence had shaped his response without needing to be acknowledged. It was not loud control. It was quiet, practiced, effective. The kind that becomes invisible if you are not looking for it. But I was looking now. Saturday would not be like the last time. Not because I would change what I offered, but because I had changed how I understood it. The invitation was the same. The table would look the same. The house would be the same. But I would not be waiting for them in the same way. The difference was not in what they would see. It was in what I would no longer expect. And that difference, small as it might seem from the outside, was the beginning of something they had not prepared for, something they would not recognize until it was already in front of them. Because this time I was not setting the table out of hope. I was setting it with purpose. Saturday arrived without urgency, the kind of day that moved at its own pace, indifferent to what it might become by evening. I woke up earlier than usual, not out of anticipation, but because there was nothing left to delay. The house was quiet in the same way it had been all week, but it no longer pressed against me. It simply existed, steady and unchanged. I made coffee the same way I always did, measuring each scoop carefully, letting the familiar routine anchor me in something predictable. There was comfort in that, in knowing that not everything had shifted. I did not rush into preparing the dinner. I waited until late morning before stepping into the kitchen, taking my time selecting what to make, not out of excitement, but with a kind of calm intention. I chose simple dishes, things I knew would come out well without effort, things that did not require me to stand over them or check them constantly. This was not about impressing anyone. It was about control. As the afternoon moved forward, I set the table again, placing each plate and glass in the same positions as before. 8 settings. Nothing more, nothing less. The chairs were pulled out evenly, aligned with the edges of the table, the way I had always done it. If someone had walked in, they would have seen no difference from the previous dinner. That was the point. By 5:30, everything was ready. The food was warm, the candles were placed but not yet lit, and I stood in the dining room for a moment, looking at it all without feeling the need to adjust anything. At 5:50, I lit the candles. Not because I expected them to arrive on time, but because I had decided that I would not change my timing for anyone else again. 6 o'clock came quietly. This time I did not stand by the window. I did not watch the street. Instead, I sat at the table, my hands resting lightly in front of me, my attention fixed on the space itself rather than what might enter it. At 6:10 I heard the first car. The sound of tires slowing, a door closing, voices faint but present. I did not move immediately. I let the moment unfold without rushing to meet it. Then the doorbell rang. I stood up, walked to the door, and opened it without hesitation. Michael stood there, holding a small bag of something I did not need, his expression carefully neutral. Sophie stood beside him, composed, her posture relaxed in a way that suggested she believed everything was exactly as it should be. The children moved past them quickly, their energy filling the space in a way that felt both familiar and distant at the same time. "Mom," Michael said, offering a brief smile. "This looks nice." Nice again. Always nice. Never more. I stepped aside to let them in, my own expression calm, unchanged. "Dinner is ready," I replied. No mention of the last time. No questions. No acknowledgement of anything that had been left unsaid. They moved through the house as if they had done so 100 times before, taking their usual places, settling into the rhythm that had once been ours. Sophie glanced around the room briefly, her eyes moving across the table, the settings, the arrangement, as if confirming something to herself. I noticed it, but I did not react. Instead, I returned to the kitchen and brought out the first dish, placing it at the center of the table with steady hands. The conversation started slowly, small comments, the kind people make when they are filling space rather than connecting. The children spoke about their week, their voices bright and unguarded. Michael responded when necessary, his attention divided. Sophie smiled at the right moments, her tone light, controlled. I listened. I observed. And as I sat there, surrounded by the people who had once defined my place in this world, I understood something with complete clarity. They believed they had returned to something normal. They believed this dinner was a continuation. They had no idea it was something else entirely. The conversation moved across the table in quiet, predictable patterns, the kind that never risked anything real. The kind that stayed safely above the surface where nothing could be questioned or challenged. I watched the way Sophie guided it without appearing to, how she redirected topics with a simple comment, how she filled any pause before it could grow into something uncomfortable. It was subtle, practiced, almost invisible. Few were not paying attention. But I was paying attention now. Every shift, every interruption, every carefully placed word. Michael spoke about work for a while, about deadlines and meetings, about how busy things had been lately. I listened without interrupting, nodding when appropriate, letting him finish without offering solutions the way I used to. That was new. He noticed it just briefly, a flicker of something crossing his face before he looked down at his plate again. The children carried most of the energy at the table, their voices rising and falling naturally, unaware of the quiet structure around them. I let them speak, asking simple questions, giving them space that no one tried to take away. That too was noticed. Sophie glanced at me once when I did it, her expression unchanged, but her eyes sharper for a second, as if she were measuring something that no longer behaved the way she expected. When the main dishes were nearly finished, I stood up and walked into the kitchen without explanation. No one followed. No one asked. That told me everything I needed to know. I returned with the dessert, placing it carefully at the center of the table, the same cake I had prepared days earlier, now set before them as if time had not passed at all. The candles were already in place. I lit them slowly, one by one, the small flames steady and controlled. No one spoke while I did it. The room grew quieter, not because anything had been said, but because something had shifted in a way they could feel without understanding. I sat back down and looked at them, really looked this time not as the people I had known for years but as they were in that moment. Michael waiting without knowing what for. Sophie, composed but alert, her attention no longer divided. The children curious, watching the candles. I did not raise my voice. I did not change my tone. I found something this week. I said, keeping my words simple even. Michael looked up immediately. Sophie did not move, but her focus sharpened again, her stillness more deliberate now. Something your father left behind, I continued. I saw it then, the smallest reaction, almost nothing, just a tightening in Sophie's posture. A shift in the way she held her shoulders. Michael leaned forward slightly, his attention fully engaged. For the first time that evening. What do you mean? He asked. I did not answer right away. Instead, I reached beside my chair and lifted the wooden case onto the table, placing it gently in front of me. The sound of it meeting the surface was soft, but it carried weight. I opened it without hesitation, revealing the documents inside, neatly arranged, exactly as they had been when I first saw them. I did not push them forward. I did not explain them in detail. I simply turned one page, then another, letting the quiet speak for itself. Michael's eyes followed the movement, his expression shifting as recognition began to form, not fully, not yet, but enough to unsettle him. Sophie remained still, but her stillness was no longer relaxed. It was controlled, calculated, watching. I rested my hand lightly on the papers and looked back at them. I thought it was time we all understood how things actually stand, I said. And for the first time since they had walked through my door that evening, no one at the table knew what would come next. I did not rush the explanation because I had learned that silence often reveals more than words ever could, and in that moment, the silence around the table was doing exactly what I needed it to do. Michael's eyes moved between the documents and my face, searching for something familiar, something he could hold on to, but there was nothing there for him to recognize. Not anymore. Sophie finally leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but tighter than before. I am not sure I understand what this is about, she said, her tone carefully neutral. I nodded once, acknowledging the question without softening it. That makes sense, I replied. You were never meant to. I turned one of the documents toward Michael, not pushing it all the way across, just enough for him to see his father's signature, the dates, the structure. He leaned in, reading slowly, his brow tightening as the meaning began to take shape. This is about the house, he said, his voice uncertain. Yes, I answered simply. He looked up at me again, confusion now giving way to something heavier. But I thought everything was shared, he continued, glancing briefly at Sophie before returning his attention to the page. I let that thought hang in the air. For a moment before responding. You thought what you were shown, I said. That is not the same thing as what is real. Sophie's hand rested lightly on the edge of the table, her fingers still, but the tension in them visible now. She did not interrupt again. That told me she understood more than she was willing to say out loud. Michael turned another page, his movements slower now, more deliberate. This says you are the sole owner, he said quietly. I nodded. It has always been that way, I replied. Your father made sure of it. The room shifted again, not dramatically, but enough that it could be felt. The balance they had walked in with, the quiet assumption that nothing had truly changed, began to dissolve piece by piece. The children had stopped talking now, their attention drawn by the change in tone, by the way the adults around them no longer sounded the same. I softened my voice slightly when I spoke again, not for Michael, not for Sophie, but for them. This is not about taking anything away, I said. It is about making sure nothing is taken from me. Michael sat back slowly, the paper still in his hands, his expression unsettled in a way I had never seen before. Mom, why are you showing us this now? He asked. I met his eyes, holding his gaze without hesitation. Because I realized something this week, I said. I realized that waiting for a place at this table is not the same as having one. The words settled heavily between us, not loud, not dramatic, but final in a way that did not need emphasis. Sophie exhaled quietly, the smallest shift, but enough to break the stillness she had maintained. No one is trying to take anything from you, she said, her voice measured, controlled. I turned my attention to her then, fully for the first time that evening. You are right, I said calmly. Not anymore. That was the moment it changed completely. Not in a way that could be seen from the outside, but in the way they looked at me, in the way the certainty they had carried into this room no longer fit the situation in front of them. Michael placed the document back on the table, his movements careful, as if he were afraid of what it represented. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply sat there, absorbing something he had never been prepared to face. I closed the wooden case gently and rested my hand on top of it. "Dinner is getting cold," I said, my tone returning to something familiar, almost ordinary. But nothing about the table felt the same anymore. And they knew it.